So moving on into section 1.5, we start discussing solving quadratic equations. And quadratic equations you worked with a lot in Algebra 2. So when we solve a quadratic equation, we are finding the x-intercepts. X-intercepts are also known as solutions, roots, answers. All of these words are synonyms. X-intercepts, solutions, roots, answers. And we can solve quadratic equations by factoring, by using the square root property, by completing the square, or the fail-proof way is to use the quadratic formula. Now the quadratic formula, some people like to go right to it, but it usually requires the most work. And all of these allow us to find the x-intercept, solutions, roots, answers. So once again, all of those words mean exactly the same thing when it comes to solving quadratic equations. So in this video, we're going to hit just the first two options. So first of all, we can solve a quadratic equation by factoring. And you got to have eyes that can see when to factor. So that's why factoring is sometimes not the first thing that people go to. So if we want to factor here, this one's easy to factor. First of all, is it in descending order? Yes. 2, 1, and none. We're talking about the exponents on the x, or powers of x. 2 powers of x, 1 power of x, no powers of x. And of course, in order to factor, we also need to be set equal to 0. So in this one, it's pretty simple to factor. First of all, we have a 1 up front, which makes it really easy. And factors of positive 10 that add up to negative 7 are x minus 2 and x minus 5. So we can easily factor that. And when we factor it, after we factor it, we're going to take each factor and set each factor independently equal to 0, which will give us our two x-intercepts of positive 2 and positive 5. So our solutions are 2 and 5. So that is solving by factoring. We can also use the square root property, and the square root property is when the squared expression must be isolated on one side of the equation. So if we have 9x squared plus 25, this is the squared expression, 9x squared. We want it isolated on one side of the equation. So the square root property is really mostly helpful when we only have two terms. Notice 1, 2. This is a binomial expression. So if we're going to isolate the squared term, we need to take the 25 that is positive and move it from the left to the right. So that will transform this equation to 9x squared equals negative 25. So after we isolate the squared term, then we can apply the square root property, which is simply to take the square root of both sides. The square root of 9x squared is 3x, and the square root of negative 25 is plus or minus 5i. Now we could have divided by 9 first, but I'm just going to divide by 3 here on the back end. We get the same thing, same answers regardless. X equals plus or minus 5i over 3. So those are our two solutions. Remember, the plus or minus is implying two answers. So what are our answers? Our answers are 5i root 3 and negative 5i root 3. This, of course, had two imaginary roots. Square root property one more time. In this case, the squared term is a quantity, and this quantity is being raised to the second power. But all the same, the squared expression is isolated. So all we need to do is take the square root of both sides. So the square root is going to undo the square. So we get x minus 2. The square root of 36 is plus or minus 6. And yes, whenever we're solving equations, we will consider the principal root as well as the negative root because we're looking for every possible solution that will make the equation true. So plus 2, x equals 6 plus 2, or x equals negative 6 plus 2. Therefore, x equals 8 or negative 4. So our two roots are 8 and negative 4. So that is solving by factoring and solving by using the square root property.